I'll share with you the title of this sermon. I don't often share the title until it gets sent out by email and the weekly e-blasts are posted online. But I thought this was good and would probably lighten your spirits. You can't do it. It's probably the worst selling motivational speech, right? You can't do it. But my question, it's a rhetorical one, but my question for you is this. Has God ever called you to do something that you just couldn't do? Has God ever called you to do something that you just couldn't do? Now, if you can't think of something, because the answer should be yes, right? That yes, there's plenty of those things. If you can't think of something and you want to say no to that, that you always do everything that God has ever told you to do, either you're not listening very well, or you've just been ignoring the times that and you've just tuned the Lord out when He has asked you to do something. What is that, Lord? I couldn't quite hear you. What were you asking me to do? Maybe it was something big, like the Lord was calling you to the mission field, but you just couldn't do it. But most likely it's something far less dramatic than that, right? Those are the big things, and there are things like that in our lives. But most likely it's something less dramatic, something that can seem a bit smaller. Like God calling you to reach out maybe to a person in your life that you have had a falling out with, where there's a broken relationship. And the Lord's called you to be an agent of reconciliation, but you just can't do it. Last week we covered how all of us, every single one of us, falls short of the glory of God. Every single one of us. We all fall short of God's glory, which means all of us fail to be obedient 100% of the time. And we talked about how partial obedience is actually disobedience. There is no partial obedience. It's just disobedience to the Lord. But this evening I want to talk about the other ways that we fail to obey God's calling in our lives. Ignoring the call to reconciliation. Ignoring the call to share our faith with others in our lives and around us. How about ignoring the call to forgive and to receive forgiveness for others? And the human mind is crafty. We're incredibly crafty. We can justify almost every decision that we can make. We can justify it, right? And in our minds, we will come up with every reason possible why we were unable to obey God's call in our lives. And so after a while, we just believe it. How we just could not have possibly done what God was asking us to do. We come up with physical reasons. There's physical reasons, right? I'm too old now. I'm too old to do that. I can't do that, Lord, anymore. Or maybe it's the other side of it. Maybe it's I'm too young. I'm too young to do that, Lord. Or maybe it's just too dangerous. Or maybe we just don't have enough money to be able to take that kind of risk in our lives at this time. If I were more stable, then maybe I could take that kind of risk for what you're calling me to, Lord. Or maybe it's not physical, maybe it's emotional or psychological reasons that we come up with to justify why we just can't obey what the Lord's calling us to do. Maybe it would just be too painful. Or it would make us vulnerable if we did it. Or it would leave us weak and exposed. Or maybe you have that feeling of, I've just faced way too much disappointment in my life. I could not possibly take another letdown. I just couldn't do it. Or maybe I'm just too angry. I'm just too angry with that person or with those people. I couldn't possibly go to them. That's the story of Jonah, right? Or how about my life is way too stressful, I'm way too anxiety-ridden right now, I couldn't possibly follow where you're calling me to go right now, Lord. I couldn't do it. But there's also spiritual reasons. I don't really have any hope that doing what the Lord's asking me to do is really going to make for a better future for me. Or I don't think that I can trust God by taking this risk. Or I don't think that if I obey, it will bring me the real joy and purpose and meaning and contentment that my heart's really longing for. And those are just some of the excuses or the rationales that our minds conjure up for why we just can't obey God with what He's calling us to do. So we play it safe and we think that if we disobey God, and we disobey God by thinking that it's going to be for our good, that we're going to be better off for it. But the reality is that the disobedience is never for our good. It's always, in the end, destructive to our lives in the long run. Well, the hope of the gospel is that God, bring us children of disobedience to glory, He sent His perfectly obedient Son into this world to die the death that we deserve and to give us new and unending life through His resurrection from the dead. That's the hope of the gospel. And the fruit of that gospel in our lives is a newfound life of trust in God, who loves us, that He would do enough that He would do that for us. And a newfound hope for the future, that we now know our future is all wrapped up and assured through Jesus' victory over sin and death and the devil. Hope is always before us, always. And that kind of trust and that hope, the fruit that the gospel brings into our hearts and lives, it gives us a freedom and a newfound courage to dare to obey God's call in our lives, no matter how difficult or dangerous or scary it might seem to us in any given moment. And that, my friends, is the gospel message that I believe is being born out of Joshua 17. The way that Joshua 17 is pointing us to the cross, and it's pointing us to the fulfillment of our salvation in Jesus Christ, for you and for me. So how do we get there from Joshua 17? Well, last week in Joshua 16, for those who weren't here or might have missed or didn't go back and listen, Joshua had two sons, and the people of the people of Joseph, who are part of Ephraim and Manasseh, have come to get their allotment, to receive their inheritance after the conquest of the land. And last week we talked about the inheritance that was given to the people of Ephraim, and how they did not drive out the Canaanites as God had commanded them to do. Instead, they forced them into indentured servitude. We talked about the fact that they did not, that's what the text told us, they did not drive them out, and they didn't do it because they thought that there was a better way. That's why they decided not to obey and to fully carry out. They were partially obedient to the Lord, but they weren't wholly obedient, and therefore they were disobedient. And the devastation that disobedience would bring into their lives will last for generations in devastating ways, as read the whole book of Judges. In Joshua 17, we turn to the people of Joseph's first son, Manasseh. And the people of Manasseh also failed to obey God, but they do it in a little bit different way. A little bit different. But the difference is subtle, but it's important. In verses 12 to 13, we were told this: "Yet the people of Manasseh could not take possession of those cities, but the Canaanites persisted to dwell in the land. Now when the people of Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out." So last week, while the people of Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites as God had commanded them, the people of Manasseh here in Joshua 17 were told could not drive out the Canaanites from the cities as God had commanded them to do. It's a distinction, right? It may be a small distinction, but there's definitely a distinction. And however insignificant that distinction may seem, for the people of Ephraim, it was a matter of will that they did not obey the Lord. And for the people of Manasseh, it's a matter of ability. It's a matter of ability, at least according to Joshua 17. They could not. The people of Ephraim did not, because it seemed more advantageous, as we talked last week, to not do it and to force them into indentured servitude. It would work, they believed, to their benefit in the long run. But the people of Manasseh could not. And the reason they could not, at least what the word means itself, is because they didn't have the strength to do so. That's what the Greek word means that we translate as could not. It means they were not able. They did not have the power or the strength. But the Greek word can also be translated like this, that they could not endure. They could not endure. And I like that translation for one reason, and that because it implies that it's more than just a lack of physical strength. There was more going on here than that they were just weak, or they didn't have the right numbers, or their strategies weren't as good as those of the Canaanites. It tells that there's more going on here. It speaks to a lack of not only physical ability, but emotional, psychological ability, and a lack of, ultimately, the spiritual ability to obey the Lord and to continue to push out the Canaanites altogether. The people of Manasseh could not do it. It was too much for them. It was too hard. It was too grueling. It was too painful. Perhaps it was too hopeless in their minds to even try. And I think we can understand that. I think we can relate to that. At least if we're honest with ourselves. But while it said the people could not, if we go all the way back to Joshua 1, where this whole thing began, it seems like a long time ago now, doesn't it? A long, long time ago. In Joshua 1, verse 2, when God's calling Joshua, these were the words of promise that he spoke. He said, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving them to the people of Israel." You notice he didn't say, go into the land that I am giving them, except those cities of Manasseh's inheritance. He didn't give an exception, did he? No, he said, this is the land that I'm giving them. These are the people that I'm going to drive out before you. No, all of the promised land God promised. God promised that he would give all of the promised land to his people as a gift. It was a gift from him to his people. So Joshua 17 tells us that the people of Manasseh could not, that they didn't have the ability, which is actually true. They couldn't. They didn't have the ability. We have no reason to doubt what we're being told here. They didn't have the physical, they didn't have the emotional, the psychological, or the spiritual strength to take possession of those cities and to cast out the Canaanites as God had commanded them to do. That's true. But what they had was something much greater. What they had was something much greater than their own ability. They had the promise of God. All they had to do was to trust God's promise and to risk it, to risk it for the future hope that awaited them, that God had laid out before them and had given them. But they didn't do it. Because they let the little fact that they couldn't do it get in the way of all that God could do and promised that he would do for them. Friends, how much have we missed out on because we just couldn't do it? Because we're too old, or because we're too young. We got some young ones in here. They're not listening to me, but they're here. Right, Eliza? Or too weak. Or we're just too poor. We can't do it. Or we're just too scared. We can't do it. Or we're too stressed. Or we're just too angry. Or we're just too busy. That's a big one, isn't it? I'm just too busy right now. There's too many other things that I've got to do. Because the truth is, all of those things are true. They are true. But the biggest obstacle of all to obediently following where God is leading us and where he is calling us in our lives is that we just in our heart of hearts don't believe that we can trust him. And we cannot see the hope in following where he leads. Because if those two things were rooted in our hearts, there's nothing that would stop us. There's nothing we wouldn't risk. I was watching an interview yesterday with Jordan Peterson that he did with Elon Musk, which is incredibly two very smart people talking to each other. Which, if you can understand half of it, it was incredibly interesting. It was fascinating, and they were talking about having children. You know, it's a big topic if you ever follow things that Elon Musk talks about, and he has 12 of them. If you follow some of the big topics, and how culture sees children as a burden and not a blessing. How our culture sees having children as a hardship and not a joy. But in the midst of their dialogue, as they were kind of coming to agreement about this issue, Jordan Peterson said something that was really simple, but at the same time I thought was incredibly profound. He said, the future's always a challenge, and having children is a vote for the future. It was pretty simple, but it was incredibly profound, and it connects to this in a deep way, because it got me thinking in a post-Christian worldview, a post-biblical worldview culture that we live in, which rejects God's truth, right? Which rejects God's truth claims, what God has revealed to be true, and things like God's call to us in creation to be fruitful and multiply. That's part of God's call to us. Or in Psalm 127, right? Children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hand of the warrior are the children of our youths. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. That's what God's revealed about children, right? But instead, in our culture, we see children as a burden and a hardship. So what's happened, though, if you look at what's happened in the culture, is two things. One, the obvious, and that is a distrust and ultimately a rejection of God and his revealed truth, right? So a distrust of God and what God has said is good and what God has said is a blessing. But the second of it is this, a lack of hope for the future. It's a lack of hope for the future. When hope for the future is gone, what happens is it's replaced by fear. It's replaced by fear. And out of fear, we cannot possibly do the things that God has called us to do. And the reasons are endless. The people of Manasseh lost hope in the future God had promised. They lost hope in a future the way that God had told them it would be. And out of fear, they allowed their own inabilities to be the justifying cause for their disobedience. Or their partial obedience, right? Which we talked about last week is really just disobedience. Friends, we do the same thing. We look at the broken relationships in our lives. And despite God's clear word that we are called to forgive, and that through Christ we have been given the ministry of reconciliation. That's God's word. Or Jesus' word about coming to the Lord's table, that before we come, first you better be reconciled with your brother, right? These are commands. These are God's calls. And yet we just can't do it. Again, this is just one example. And we justify that we can't do it because it's too hard. Maybe it's been too long. Maybe we've just been hurt too often. Or we've been taken advantage of just too much. Or it's going to make us feel and look weak and vulnerable. And guess what? All of that is probably true. But the Lord who has called you to this work is the same God who sent his one and only Son into this world to die for you, to reconcile you to him and me to him. And through his work of reconciliation, we have the ultimate hope for the future. And we can trust the one who would not even spare his own Son to reconcile us to him, to bring about the reconciliation of our broken relationships. Friends, when you put your trust in Jesus' work of reconciliation, your future is sure and it is certain. And under the protection of Jesus and the hope of the future that we have in him, we're free. We're free to boldly risk for the work that God's calling us to do, no matter what that may be in your life right now, whether it's to go out onto the mission field, maybe to France. We need you in France. We need you here too. I'm not just judging France, but after what we saw this week, we need you in France. The gospel needs to be proclaimed. But maybe it's not just going onto the mission field. Maybe it's just to share your faith with your coworker. That's a scary thing. It could be a risky thing. But if God's calling you to do it, you're free to trust him. You're free because your future, in your hope of a future, is secure. We're free to risk pursuing healing of reconciliation of those broken relationships in our lives. We're free to admit to our children, which is probably the hardest thing in the world to do, right? At least it is for me, that we're wrong. And to humbly ask them for forgiveness. No matter what he is calling you to be obedient for and to do, you can't do it. But he is mighty, and he is able, and he will empower you to trust him who can, and to give you the hope of future that you need to be freed to live into that calling. You cannot do it, but God can and will and has provided you with a hope and a future that nothing in this world can destroy. Praise God. Amen.